Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar where we will be looking at complex ground hazards with Terrafirma. My name is Bronwyn Townsend and I'm the Marketing Manager here at InfoTrack. I'm joined today by Tim Longden from Terrafirma. In this session, we will look at man-made and natural ground hazards with case studies from across the UK, as well as reviewing the new coastal hazards update. Before we begin the webinar, which should take no longer than 45 minutes, I'd like to draw your attention to the box on the webinar software that allows you to ask questions. Please type them as we go through and we'll answer them at the end of the session. I'm now going to hand over to Tim to present.
Thank you very much, Bronwyn. Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you very much for your time this morning. As mentioned, my name is Tim Longden. I'm the account manager for Terrafirma. Been with the company for about 3.5 years and have been doing quite a few of these educational pieces over that time. I do apologise in advance if you hear some banging in the background. One of the unfortunate sides of working from home means that roofers will get in the way. But if you do have any questions, as mentioned, please use the Q&A box and we will answer them at the end. So what we're going to go through today, just firstly going to introduce Terrafirma for those who are potentially a little less familiar with our business, and then going to go through basically all the ground hazards that are out there that we cover. So starting with the man-made ones of mining and then going into the natural ones, and also introduce coastal hazards as well. And then finally, I'm going to finish off by going through sort of the key features of the ground report and some key benefits, and then I'll hang around at the end for some question and answers. So for those who are potentially less familiar with Terrafirma, we are still relatively, I guess, a relatively new entrant into the business. We only recently celebrated our 5th birthday. And really, our vision coming into it has been very much to transform how sort of we collectively understand the ground. And how we're doing this is by truly, our amazing team. We have a growing team of, many disciplines, largely focusing around these ground hazards. So things like geoscience, soil science, geotechnical engineering, and the like. Then, of course, have these wonderful data specialists and computer scientists who are able to basically put all the magic together and produce these reports for yourselves. And really, our goal is to try and help people and businesses understand their exposure to the risk of damage and disruption and financial loss from these geohazards. So just a little bit of a touch on our team, because I will be referring back to our expertise a number of times during this webinar. Because we do believe that really within the industry it is virtually second to none, because we do really try and, of course, focus our understanding on ground hazards, and we do that through having the expertise behind us. So going through, we have Tom Backhouse, who is a geologist and he is the founder of the business. He has been making real big strides and positive disruptions within the industry and also within sort of geology altogether, as part of being a Geological Society Council member. But a lot of our sort of technical expertise does, of course, come from our technical director, Chris Milne. He's been an engineering geologist for a better part of 30 years. He's been involved in several mine stability programs and is contracted by Network Rail for lots of their sort of slope instability problems. So has a vast amount of experience within there. We did make a big song and dance about the hiring of Tim Farewell at the beginning of the year. He pretty much wrote the book on soil subsidence in the UK, and so having him as an authority in that business, helping guide our reports and products, is of course a massive value. And then we do actually, for cases in Cornwall, have a partnership set up with a company down there called Cornwall Consultants. Dan Berryman is the MD there, and he has over 25 years of experience in understanding and assessing mining hazards there, and so of course has been able to impart invaluable experience to us as well. And then we have a team of geologists and myself. I am a geologist by trade, and I am joined by several others such as Maura, Ben and Danny. And we are sort of the team who will help sort of fabricate these reports, but also provide our expert interpretation to give that extra sort of key benefits to those reports. So with this expertise, we can then basically use it to validate our data which we use. And data is vital to what we do, being death study reports, but it is just a tool that we use to understand more about hazards and its potential exposure. Unfortunately, with third-party data, there can be quite a few issues. It can be of variable quality. It can be very much of different suitability for different ground hazards, and comes from a range of sources, from open, which of course have to be taken with a bit more careful, but also commercial and government sources as well. And really, our expertise allows us to sort of use our understanding in sort of geology, geoscience, and these geohazards, and then use our sort of team skills as well to really result in validating this data, to make sure that through our reports we are using the right data, not necessarily always talking about the best data or the most unique data or who has the most data. It is very much about trying to find the right data in order to create the best sort of assessment for these reports. And through using that expertise to guide us to the right data, it does allow us to make quality products. So our innovative products are first to market, and they aim to provide professional value, choice, and opportunity for clients. And really, it sort of focuses in on this understanding of risk assessment. So what I'm going to just quickly go on here is this understanding of risk, as it is the likelihood of harm based on both the hazard and the exposure. So the hazards being both these natural features such as coastal erosion, clay subsidence, but also these man-made ones being mining notably, but then also oil and gas extraction and others. And really what the data tells us is the location of these hazards. And so if you are getting a report, which is basically just dumping a load of data and detailing that, you are just getting a location of a hazard, which in itself is a form of potential risk. Really, you then might get a subsequent report which will detail the exposure, how close it is to this residential or commercial property or development land. And often if you are left with those two sort of initial sort of screening reports, it is then often being left up to yourselves as conveyancers to create that risk assessment for yourselves. And if you are having to interpret the results of the report to try and produce a risk assessment for your potential client or the lender, you are going to then be viewed as the professional who is an authority in that area providing that information. As a result, it does potentially leave liability on yourselves. However, Terrafirma, what we really focus on and is the key sort of drive for our reports is providing that risk assessment. So using our expertise to understand the hazard, how it interacts with the exposure to generate that risk and essentially transfer any liability onto ourselves. And while we hope our reports speak for themselves, we do then, of course, have our team of geologists backed up here to help. I did run it past Maura. She was happy for me to use this photo. I thought it was a very good one. It was originally me, but I thought it looked horrible. So here we are. So without further ado, I'm going to start introducing and going through these hazards and a little bit on how they can affect property. So firstly, if we start with coal mining, this is very much the most well-known entity within sort of conveyancing industry. And I'll sort of go on a little bit as to further why. So this image here is, hopefully as you well recognise, an image of the UK, and the area sort of shaded in light grey marks the coal reporting area, which essentially outlines the coalfield. You'll notice a few of these, particularly on the east side of the map, extend out to the sea. This is where you do have some offshore coal bed methane mining and the likes. I'm not going to be focusing on those because there's not really much property floating out on the ocean. But the coalfield here, as you can see, it is vast and it does stretch nationwide. Hopefully it is an image that you are familiar with. What I find quite interesting is, many people aren't actually too aware of the little bit of coal mining into North Devon, but also across to Kent as well, where mining did occur in the early 20th century. And so coal mining has in this country occurred since the Stone Age and continued pretty much continuously since then and until this day, although the last underground coal mine did close in 2015. The majority of this mining in this country did occur during the Industrial Revolution. This is where we really sort of conjure up images of, the Midlands and Yorkshire of that coal mining industry, and was a massive surge forward to drive the country into sort of the future at that point. And at peak production, there were well over 1 million people employed within the industry. And so it was a huge, huge feature and has a huge legacy across the country. In terms of some numbers, the coalfield, as you saw, is vast. It is greater than the entire area of Wales. And as a result of this, there is unfortunately a huge exposure of property, be it both commercial, land and residential, to this hazard. There are 8 million different properties that lie within the coalfield, and that's approximately 30% of properties within England and Wales. And a feature which is most notably sort of sought after is, of course, mine entries. And given that there are, over 170,000 of these across the country, you do see that there is, again, a huge exposure of property, but part of 500,000 properties exposed to these mine entries. So given this huge legacy of coal mining, and also following the wake of some of the damages from more recent underground workings, there was a Coal Mining Subsidence Act passed in 1991. This essentially gave statutory responsibility of this coal mining legacy within the country to the government, essentially, and through a government body which is now known as the Coal Authority. This is why it is a legal requirement to get these coal mining searches within coalfield areas. And as a result, for this coal mining damages, there is that safety net in place. So while, as I mentioned, the last underground coal mine in the country closed in 2015, this historic legacy still does pose risk to property today. So often what is seen in the news and media articles are, of course, sinkholes being very much the worst case scenario of the manifestation of these coal mining hazards, but of course, unsurprisingly, the most visually spectacular and newsworthy. So these can be through collapses of old mine shafts, when these sort of more industrial revolution ones were abandoned. Sometimes they weren't even filled in, they were just capped up with old railway sleepers. So at the time they were made of wood, and unsurprisingly would have a tendency to potentially rot over the years. So this was a case of a coal mine shaft which collapsed up in Newcastle. But it isn't just coal mine shafts. You can get collapse of these shallow underground workings, essentially where very shallow underground void space can migrate to the surface, especially when you park a car on it. Fortunately, no one was harmed, and that was in Wednesbury. And sometimes it can occur not beneath property, but also then pose potential risks of loss of crops, but also agricultural equipment and health hazard as well, as seen here. But typically, when you consider or think of coal mining and its impact on property, the typical association is, of course, subsidence. So during the sort of 1990s and early 2000s, the form of mining that was occurring in the country essentially was controlled collapse of mine workings. So as the mining was occurring, it was essentially allowing the roof of the mine underneath the ground to collapse, and that's what was resulting in the surface subsidence and the wake of these huge amounts of subsidence claims. But unfortunately, while you would expect that this would be an effect of more well-established properties, it can still affect even new build sites as well. So this was a particular case actually up in Newcastle again, where a new build property fell foul of unrecorded coal mine workings, which resulted in the irreparable subsidence damage of 19 of the properties less than 4 years after completion, and so they were all subsequently demolished. And then it doesn't actually even need to result in any sort of ground instability to actually affect a property transaction. There's a particular case in, again, in the Midlands, where essentially a couple were trying to sell their house and had a mine shaft basically recorded in their neighbour's garden, and it was resulting in the house being unsellable because potential purchasers were coming in, seeing that mine shaft nearby, and basically just not understanding the risk it would pose and being scared by it because of this, increased visibility of these sinkholes in the media. And that was also affecting the lenders' policies when they did eventually find a potential purchaser to, who was willing to go ahead with the purchase. The same bank that had even given the couple their mortgage 10 years previously was refusing to lend 10 years later on the same situation. And so these features can unfortunately really leave people trapped in their homes. And it does require, in our belief, an interpretive methodology in order to really try and identify the true risk to a property. So as a first case study for this, I'm going to focus on this particular case up in Rastrick, which is in West Yorkshire. So here you can see the property outlined in red, and there is a mine entry, of course, recorded beneath the house. The red circle marked around it is noting what's known as its zone of influence. As essentially, if that mine entry were to collapse in that location, what is the sort of surface area that it would impact? So that's based on features such as the size of the mine shaft, but also then depth of surface soils, the type of soils, those geoscientific principles. So from that, you can calculate its basically zone of influence. So currently in this plotted position, the mine entry is of course a bit of a red flag. However, if we take this interpretive methodology, which a lot of the time involves interrogation of historic land use and corroboration with additional sources such as historical mapping, we find that the mine shaft could actually be, from historical mapping, be located up to 14 meters west of that plotted location. This is in essence because these mine features are often recorded from very historical records of quite variable quality. So things like old mining plans and abandonment plans that have been taken from the late 1800s, of course, do have a degree of uncertainty. So this historical mapping, if you take the position of that new mine shaft location and move that zone of influence there as well, you can see that that red circle is no longer affecting that site boundary, and therefore this mine shaft may not be affecting the property at all. So through that interpretive methodology, you can really start to put together a complete picture of the risk to that property. But a feature I want to just touch on here, which leads me nicely onto the next section, is the fact that this mine entry is actually documented to have extracted a mineral known as flag rock. Flag rock is a type of sandstone specific up to this part of Yorkshire. And as mentioned, the Coal Mining Subsidence Act gives this statutory cover of this coal mining legacy to the Coal Authority, but it is specific to coal mining hazards. The Coal Authority hold no liability for damages resultant from non-coal mining features. Now, unfortunately, we see that there is often a false sense of security for properties within a coal field, as they're told in a coal mining area, get a coal report, your due diligence is done. But unfortunately, these non-coal hazards are spread far and wide across the country and also do occur within these coal mining areas. And so while it is important to obtain that coal mining assessment, of course, It is also important, for where relevant, to consider the potential impact of these all other mining hazards, which leads me quite nicely into all other mining. So this is very much a broad topic, as within the property industry, the most widely talked about material is coal, but there are over 55 different materials that have been mined across this country, and this stretches back thousands and thousands of years, since pretty much as early as people could use tools. And as a visual representation of how these hazards are potentially stretched across the country, this map here is showing these areas of known underground mining across the country. And you can see that it is vast, and it basically stretches across the entirety of it. So this can be basically through, things like chalk for sort of agricultural and farming materials, to metals for, of course, use in industry or for wiring or for cars and the like. Basically, every sort of town and city in the UK does have some form of mineral extraction legacy. Things like bricks that are used to build the houses, the clays were often sourced locally in order to make them. You go to places like Bath, and all these beautiful buildings have this lovely Bath stone facades. That is, of course, from extraction of Bath stone locally. So there is a huge amount of legacy of these non-coal mining hazards, which do sometimes go under the radar. In terms of some numbers, specific to sort of mine entries, there are an estimated 33,000 parcels of land registry parcels within 40 metres of a non-coal mine entry, which are then often not so well known of. There are over 90 recorded non-coal collapses since 2014, and while mineral extraction within the country is sort of on the decline, there were still over 201 million tonnes of minerals extracted from the UK landmass in 2018. So as mentioned, there are over 55 different minerals extracted in the UK, yet until recently, only 6 were actually sort of legislated for within North Society guidance. This was coal, brine, limestone, specific in the West Midlands, tin, china clay, and ball clay. And these were more reactive features for where some sort of subsidence or collapse had occurred. For example, Cheshire brine resulted in mass subsidence there from the wild brine pumping, or in the West Midlands, the limestone mining resulted in subsidence there. And so reactively, these features were put into the guidance to basically cover it. Whereas we are encouraging people to recognize that there is this huge legacy, and it can still impact property today. This be through chalk mining, closing schools, from collapses, from mine shafts or other chalk mines, or sort of other iron mines, clay mines, and these are stretched all across the country and are vast. And again, it is unfortunately not specific just to sort of older properties that have not had these searches available. We did see in Plumstead in East London, a new build site basically be built on top of a historic chalk mine, and a couple of years after completion, a collapse did occur beneath, outside one of the back doors, as you can see here on the right. And essentially, they hadn't considered the fact that there was potentially underground chalk mining hazards there, and so in the development phase, dug 3 exploratory boreholes when they should have been digging nearer to 100 to check for these voided grounds. So it is not necessarily through any fault of people at the stage, it is through potential lack of awareness of how vast and how extensive these non-coal mining hazards are. So the case study I'm going to use for this one is one which maybe you are familiar with, the St Albans sinkhole. As you can see from the photo, it was a pretty enormous collapse, and it of course did the rounds in the newspapers when it occurred in 2015. It forced the evacuation of the nearest properties and actually cut utilities for every property within the cul-de-sac. And as you can imagine, there wasn't just that loss of utilities being the impact. For anyone who's potentially trying to sell at this point, someone who's going to look at this particular road in St Albans when they're buying a house would now start potentially seeing images of these sinkholes, and that could have a tangible effect on the property value. Although I have been told that the property here is so in demand that the value did end up getting soaring back up once it had been stabilised. But it did take 14 months for these old mine workings, and it was investigated and found to be an old chalk mine that collapsed, and 14 months to be stabilised and for people to return to their homes. So again, how an interpretive methodology would look at this to try and elude the hazards, again, would initially start looking as a really good source of information at historic land use. So here, the orange triangle in the middle is marking the recorded location of that sinkhole. So as you can see, it's within the middle of a brickfield. Brickfields normally basically mined, as you can see, the sort of surface workings, local clays, in order to produce the bricks. But what is also seen on here, which is something that is often not picked up on or often missed, is this lime kiln nearby. Now, lime kilns were basically used on site as a way of creating lime for the brickmaking process. But the cheapest and most effective way to get that lime was through mining chalk. And in these areas where there was a surface covering of clays, the way to get chalk would be through underground mining. So through an interpretive methodology and an understanding of the mining techniques within the area, this identification of brickfield plus a lime kiln in this area with that local geological conditions would indicate straight away to us that there would be underground workings potentially there, and so further investigations required. So that's a very quick run through on these sort of anthropogenic mining hazards. I am having to go through quite quickly because there is unfortunately just quite a lot to cover in terms of these hazards because they are stretched pretty nationwide, as you've seen. So on to soil-related subsidence. This is one of the most sort of nationwide afflicted cases and most costly to the UK economy. So this image here is basically showing the rough distribution of these soil subsidence hazards, the areas shaded in darker red being the areas which are deemed to be of potential higher risk, and of course the lighter colours being the potential lower risk. So interestingly, you'll see that this is very much concentrated towards the southeast of England, and this is literally owing to just the geological conditions of it being present there. In terms of numbers, you may remember the wonderful World Cup summer of 2018, but during that very nice hot, dry period, there was over 10,000 subsidence claims with an estimated cost of about £64 million. And over the last decade, it's estimated that subsidence claims from these soil hazards have resulted in a cost of £3 billion to the UK economy. So there's a huge amount of money being basically lost in here owing to this geohazard. So what it essentially comes from is natural conditions within the soil resulting in this ability to shrink and swell. And basically the material specifically is clays. Clays are basically formed by the breakdown of surface soils or bedrock, and unfortunately do have a tendency to shrink and swell with the amount of water they hold within their structure. So while it is therefore important to consider the soil type and the soil shrinkability, as it's known as, what that basically is intrinsically tied to, of course, is climate as well. And that is often a step which is missed by some pre-existing soil hazard models. And so this one is again constructed through Dr. Timothy Farewell and his work at Cranfield University. As I mentioned, he is a real authority in this area. And basically with these clays in soils, there is a natural balance for areas where there is a relatively consistent climate. So if it's not extended hot, dry periods or very short extended wet periods as well, you do get a natural balance where it's not going to shrink or swell in much volume. But as you see in the southeast, where the climate is a little more variable, basically these hot, dry summers and cooler, wetter winters, you do get this basically extenuation of that hazard. So there's a little video to sort of visually illustrate this. It's again made by Dr. Tim Farewell. It's showing how water will affect different soils. So the first one is a sandy soil, and running water can wash away that sand. It's known as a running sand effect, but that's only where there's poor drainage, where basically the soil can rush away too. As you can see, for a normal soil known as loam, the water doesn't affect it, but where you have that clay, as you hopefully saw there, it did result in its expansion. So if you imagine soils drying through a hot, dry summer, you can see there that it is shrinking and subsiding. Whereas the non-clay rich soil is staying pretty much the same, and not that sand would actually result in the raising of it again because it's unlikely to be reintroduced. But a close-up of it, if you have poor drainage and the sand washes away, it can result in that subsidence, but really does show how that sort of clay does result in that volume change. So how it impacts property, you know, if you imagine that property was built entirely on that naturally shrinkable clay, it may just go up and down uniformly as a result of it just being basically a consistent movement across the board. However, where this really starts to become a problem is specifically where properties can be built on two different types of soil. So if you picture a sandy soil where basically the water change is not going to change in the volume of that clay, and one side where it is on that shrinkable clay, you have what is known as differential settlement, which of course results in these characteristic cracks appearing. And importantly, another feature to consider is also the effect of trees. This is again often a step which is missed by a lot of models, but really trees can be a real pain for properties, particularly where these shrinkable soils occur. Not only can their roots come in and basically wrap themselves around foundations and damage that way, but essentially because trees are a form of greater surface area and losing water a lot quicker than the ground, they will then replace that water loss by taking it from the ground itself. And as a result, a side of a property that is nearer a tree with these shrinkable clays will lead to, again, differential settlement. So very much important to not only consider the effect of, you know, climate and therefore climate change potentially affecting this soil subsidence hazard, it is also very important to consider the effect of trees that it can have on the property. So on to coastal hazards. So as an island nation, the coast is very much intrinsically linked into our history and also the livelihoods of millions of people. And our perspective on the coast may well begin to change over the coming years, as property, land and infrastructure along this coastline is going to be put under very severe pressure from a changing climate and also this risk of sea level rise as well. So this will accelerate things like erosion, but also landslip and coastal flooding. So in terms of numbers, we do see again that there's a huge exposure to this hazard as the nature of having this vast coastline. So there's over 500,000 properties within 250 metres of the coast in England and Wales, and almost a third of this coastline is eroding at a rate of 10 centimetres a year or more. We do see parts of West Yorkshire eroding at a rate of over 4 metres a year. So if you picture you're buying a house that is 100 metres from a coastline in that area, and you're thinking, oh yeah, plenty of distance to the coast, not going to be a worry, and you then live in it for a typical mortgage lifetime of 25 years, that coastline, as you come to sell that house, is going to be right on your doorstep. And a number here that really jumps out to me personally is the fact that there's an estimated value of £1 billion worth of UK property, not that is at risk of coastal erosion, but that will be lost to the sea over the course of the next century. Part of that is, of course, due to the estimated sea level rise of about 70 centimetres. And so really is a huge amount of potential hazard along here, and therefore vital that this is now assessed as well. So again, we do see that this has been appearing in the news quite repeatedly over the last few years, and even particularly over this last winter and spring just gone. A case study I'll go through in a moment did, of course, demonstrate that in quite graphic detail, but it has been very much a feature of growing concern over the last few years. So much so for this particular case in Fairborn, actually, which is the town in West Wales, which is a very low-lying town, and it's going to be the first town in the UK to be fully decommissioned. This is because it is going to be considered too costly to introduce defences to protect that town for the value of property that will be saved. So its decommission is essentially already underway, and it is basically aimed to be completely abandoned and demolished by 2045, before the sea is then left to basically do its thing. So again, very much quite a terrifying feature. So as a visual illustration of this, this is an aerial view of a town called Widnesey, which is very much an area at war with the sea up in West Yorkshire, East Yorkshire, apologies. So dozens of coastal communities have already been lost along this stretch of coastline over the past few centuries. And following this, sea defences have been introduced, but unfortunately are somewhat failing in their defence of parts of this town. So there are some sea defences currently introduced. So the area marked in purple is where these sea defences are more well embedded, and the areas in yellow are where we see some of these more older defences that are starting to become in very poor condition. And what happens is where you get potentially undefended parts of coastline or areas that are poorly defended, you can get what's known as outflanking. So this is where the defences of the sea wall could be compromised through basically the unprotected erosion from the coast further along the line, basically coming in and coming in behind it. So if I show the estimated erosion rates over the next sort of 50 to 100 years, sorry, also a few documented landslides here. The area in orange is marking 100 meters of erosion, which is predicted potentially as a 95% confidence over the next 50 years. But if we take a worst case scenario for the potential erosion over the next 100 years, which takes the blue case in mind, you can see that there is a huge potential portion of this town which could be affected. And this is partly, does depend on things like whether the sea defences are properly maintained or whether the shoreline management plan changes. But this is a possibility for this town, because the shoreline management plan is essentially a government plan of managing the coastal erosion and flooding risk for a stretch of coastline. This has been set for the country, for every stretch of coastline in the country, and essentially it is based upon the potential value of property saved to the cost of introducing the defences to save it. And so it has to be cost effective, and as a result, we do see parts of the coastline where the shoreline management plan literally states no active intervention. So it's just being allowed to be eroded at its natural rate. And this, of course, is leading often quite small scale local communities at risk. So a case study for this is this collapse of this property called Cliffhanger on the Isle of Sheppey in Kent. This occurred just this summer and was a property that was actually bought in 2018 for cash. And so while there wouldn't have been necessarily as many searches done at that stage, as it is often cash buyers don't bother with so many, It's not even that any available searches at the time would have identified that coastal hazards information, because until September this year, that information was not available within these conveyancing reports. So this property was built in 1917 when the coastline was quite a long way away, and of course not necessarily predicting that it would be affected now. Unfortunately, in May, there was a landslide which did result in the collapse of this property, and this was owing as a result of this coastal erosion. And so the nearby properties were evacuated, and the local council have now told them that their properties are believed to go into the sea over the next 3 to 5 years. And if there's no sort of insurance available for the property, this is essentially property is now going to be unsellable, and they've been told the best they can hope for is a government grant to cover the cost of demolishing their property, as if they leave it to fall into the sea, naturally now knowing this potential hazard, they could be potentially held liable for pollution damages. So a huge potential risk, and this is partly because this area of coastline is one of these ones where the shoreline management plan is no active intervention. It's considered too costly to introduce defences to protect these properties. So a huge amount of risk, and I'll cover on how to that is assessed later within our report. Just finishing up next onto other natural ground hazards. This covers a range of things from sort of landslides to collapsible ground to running sands and soluble rocks. And as you can see, again, this is very much stretched across country and can be very variable. So collapsible ground is essentially where if ground has got a huge saturation potential, it could potentially change volume quite rapidly. These are very basically sparsely located, and typically once a property has been built on them, same with compressible ground, it results in potential slight settlement damage. And so things like settlement cracks and the like. So not necessarily a big risk for ongoing use, but something to consider for properties that have been recently built in those areas. Landslides, of course, are a little bit more self-explanatory. You can picture those, and I'll go through a couple of case studies in a moment. Running sands, that was visually illustrated in Dr. Tim's video, basically showing how if you pour in the water and the sand has got places to move, it can wash away and result in that settlement. And then soluble rocks are basically where there is naturally occurring soluble rocks in the bedrock, and as a result, percolating rainwater can result in the formation of underground cavities, and I'll go through a case study of that as well. So a first landslide case study, this was actually, as you can probably tell by the picture, a new build estate up in Mansfield and near Nottingham, and it's actually built inside an old quarry. And the quarry face was believed to be stable. It's made of old sandstone. But of course, that sandstone, as it's being, exposed to the elements, is being continuously weathered. And as a result of it being completely inundated and soaked with water, it did result in this landslip. And as you can see, it was lucky not to completely obliterate these houses. Now, an interesting element here is that there is a question of liability to who's owed this. Because if a landslide occurred for part of area of land that the person owned, so say one of these houses actually owned that area of the cliff face, of the quarry face, which did collapse, they could potentially be held liable for the damages associated with it. But fortunately for them, in this particular case, it was the local council who took responsibility over that quarry face and put out the damages. But it is just an interesting question of liability as who could be potentially held possible. Because even if a landslide starts on your property and affects someone else, it could be the place where the landslide started, which is the one held liable. And this is possibly an image that many of you have seen before. It was a very famous case study for a landslide in Scarborough a number of years ago. It was a huge scale geological landslide, which, as you can see, encroached way back into the town much further than people anticipated and resulted in the very effective destruction of a hotel. So this was basically an area where this was an old landslide itself, in essence, and it had formed a cliff face at the bottom. Basically, the sea had been constantly eroding the toe of that sort of cliff edge, and the water had started to basically cut underneath it as well. And as a result, when it then again, following a period of heavy rain, resulted in this area of land being completely inundated and soaked, and then resulted in a slip. So as you can see, these features can have hugely devastating impacts, and therefore do definitely require consideration. As an example of a soluble rock hazard, one of the areas which is unfortunately most affected by these soluble rock hazards is an area called Ripon, which is up in North Yorkshire. This is where the bedrock is locally made of gypsum. Gypsum is unfortunately very much a soluble hazard, and of course naturally percolating rainwater is dissolving natural cavities, and this area is very much sinkhole prone. So this particular collapse occurred in 2016 and resulted in the evacuation of 12 properties, and then it was quite a costly expense to put to right these damages. So again, just showing how these potential natural hazards can impact property, and yet have often gone a little bit under the radar in past years. So on to just quickly some additional hazards, ones that are not necessarily going to impact the ground stability of a site, but are important to consider as well. This is a map showing basically the outline of oil and gas planning permissions across the country. The sort of orange hatched areas are where these active licenses for exploration are in place. Although, of course, with fracking basically being put on hold, it is unlikely that there will be any sort of future oil and gas extraction. These sort of blurry blue-red areas and areas where there are mineral planning permissions. So this is essentially where there's been previously expressed interest in future extraction of materials. So how this might affect property is not so much, again, the stability, but more the potential loss of quiet enjoyment. So if you picture you have a lovely house with a current view of a golf course, but it turns out that that golf course is actually land owned by an extraction company, and they're going to turn it into a large-scale quarry. That change in view and the introduction of lots of noise and dust is, of course, potentially going to affect the quiet enjoyment of the property, which can affect the value. So again, just an important feature to be aware of when purchasing the property. And radon, something you're probably all familiar with already, is a naturally occurring ground gas, which if accumulating in a poorly ventilated property can lead up to quite toxic levels, as it is a carcinogen. So this map essentially just shows the areas where in red it is larger amounts of this naturally occurring ground gas being produced by the local geology, areas in blue where it is very much less so. And so very simple to get a radon test and then introduce some ventilation hazards, but it is a health hazard, and therefore for properties that are above the action level or within these termed radon affected areas, it is recommended by a health protection agency to get a radon test just to confirm. So very big run through of those. I'm now going to go through basically the ground report, which unsurprisingly will cover all of these hazards. So for coal mining, it is very much a modular approach to this report, and the coal mining is a standalone assessment of our Con 29M. So this is a Law Society licensed Con 29M included within this report. Was the original alternative to the Coal Authority, and for cases where a mine entry is identified within 20 meters, you will get a free, essentially, mine entry interpretive report. So one of our geologists will calculate that zone of influence, as I mentioned before, to calculate how likely that mine entry is likely to affect that property. It will also use that interpretive methodology, trying to interrogate historic land use, see if the mine entry is potentially going to be recorded elsewhere, to really provide as thorough, proper assessment as possible. It comes with a professional opinion, as well as all the indemnities one can expect. You get all the information visually represented on the site plan, and you also get included a subsidence claims buffer report for any time a claim is recorded within 50 meters of the site. For all other mining, it is, as mentioned, a huge amount of information that has to be assessed within this, but we have tried to make it into a nice, clean, concise module. For sites that are down in Cornwall, this will be passed on to our partners, Cornwall consultants, who will provide their expert assessment, apply their 25 years of knowledge, and incorporate that value into the report. But again, it is then given an expert interpretation using that interpreted methodology, and then detailed a clear professional opinion with this past advisory further action outcome. Again, all the relevant information is visually displayed on a site plan for areas which could be of interest or concern. For the soil-related subsidence, as mentioned, this benefits from the expertise of like Tim Longden. I'm sorry, my voice is going here. This incorporates this innovative data set, which basically factors in both the soil shrinkability and the effect of climate, as well as the effect of trees, which is key. This is also where it will also consider the potential change in climate as well. As a climate change model is incorporated into this model, and as you can see on the right-hand side of that report, there is a climate change adjusted sort of score, which is showing basically how the soil shrinkability risk could change over the course of the next 30 years as a result of this climate change. So from these more variable weather events, from longer, drier summers to colder, wetter winters. So huge amount of information within that module, and again is all covered with a professional opinion and this clear past advisory further action outcome. Again, all the information is visually represented on the site plan, as well as the location of recorded trees and their termed tree zone of influences. So full mature tree will have a root system that can be equivalent to the height of its basically full mature growth, and so as a result can have quite a large potential influence area. These all other natural ground hazards are again assessed within here. This is incorporating the use of British Geological Survey, and again considering all of these features from landslides to soluble rocks to running sands and even natural cavities. And again, all concluded with its own professional opinion with that clear past advisory further action outcome. And again, detailed within a side plan that you can visually see these features for yourself. The coastal hazards one. This is one that we're very excited. It was an update we introduced to the ground report in September this year, and it is the first property-specific risk assessment of coastal hazards. And that has been through lots of hard work of our team, basically taking government data set and creating it into several models, incorporating features such as landslides and coastal inundation to create this real clear property-specific hazard assessment. So answering questions like, will there be a risk of collapse over the mortgage lifetime of 20 years? Will there be a risk in the medium term of up to 50 years? So for example, if it's not a potential risk for the next 20, 30 years, but you come to sell the property in 20 years time, you're going to want to know if it is going to be a potentially growing feature then of concern, which might affect the resale of the property. And then also how the coastline management plan, the shoreline management plan is going to change over the next 20 years, and whether there have been any of these recorded landslides which might accelerate the rate of that erosion. Again, all visually represented on the site plan and given this clear professional opinion and that past advisory outcome as well. Additional ground hazard information is incorporated in here, whether you are within one of these radon affected areas, if there are any identified mineral planning permissions, and basically who to contact if you want to get further information, and then whether the site is in an active oil and gas license area as well, all detailing their own next steps of what you can do to just get those further assurances. And really what we're trying to aim and achieve in this is, the understanding that yourselves as conveyancers are specialists in property law, and that's how it should remain. You should not be required to have a complete understanding of these ground hazards and how to interpret the results of these reports. So that is why these reports are designed and made to be read and used by all parties involved within a transaction. It all benefits from our unique user key, which will be hopefully of great assistance. And basically, you can see it in the bottom right. It's where we will color code the relevant sections and appropriate recommendations for who they're most relevant to. So if it is an advisory just for the consideration of the potential purchaser, for example, further inquiries they can make just to basically secure whether it is, for example, a radon affected area or potential survey they might wish to consider, we will color code it purple for their consideration. If there are any further actions that are required on the part of conveyancer, this will be color coded in that orange action as well, just to make it abundantly clear whether it is something that is needed to be addressed prior to purchase. And then we will also, for any features that we believe need to be brought to the lender's attention, instead of leaving you to interpret the results and question, should this go to the lender, should it not, we will color code it in that yellow to make it clear whether it should be a feature for the lender's consideration before the purchase goes ahead. And all of this is backed in with a 10 million PI policy and complete robust terms and conditions, and hopefully quite clear past further action or advisory outcome to make life as easy as possible. So that's pretty much it. It is an expert-led risk assessment. It covers everything you need to know, and it was the first report to cover all mining and natural ground hazards within the report. And it does hopefully provide peace of mind for all these ground risks for yourselves and the home buyers as well. So thank you very much for your time today. If you do have any questions, now is time to keep writing them down. If you would like to find out some more information, I'll now hand you back over to Bronwyn, who will just give you a little bit of further information on that as well. But thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Tim. That was great. Doesn't look like we've got any questions at the moment. However, if you do have questions, you are welcome to send them through to us and we will get back to you later today. We hope that you found this session informative, and if you've got any questions about the products available from Terrafirma, you can contact your account manager or Tim or myself directly. We thank you for attending today, and we look forward to welcoming you to another webinar session soon. Thank you.